Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I've got 5 great movies for you that you possibly didn't know were based on books. So I had prepared my list for this video, but I thought I would do a bit of Googling and just see what other lists like this had in them. And there's some of the lists had just ridiculous films in, like Jaws and Jurassic Park and things like that, which I thought everybody knew was based on a book. Silence of the Lambs was in one of them, which again I think is a very strange choice. I thought, well, that was a very well-known book. Anyway, I'm also conscious that obviously the audience for this channel is a very literate and very intelligent audience, so it may well be that you already knew that the 5 great films I'm going to talk about were based on 5 great books. But it may not be. And I've also got a 6 kind of joker at the end, which is a okay film that was based on an okay book. I couldn't stretch things enough to call it a great film or great book. And I guess the main thing about this list is that these are all films and books that I have watched and read, and genuinely think are worth your time. So if you haven't watched any of these movies or read any of these books, then I recommend that you do so. As always, for bookish people, my preference would be to read the book before you watch the film. But everyone's different on that. Okay, so five great movies based on 5 great books. The first one is Psycho by Robert Bloch, so famously filmed by Alfred Hitchcock in 1960. The book came out in 1959, so very quickly filmed. It's a fantastic book. It's a fantastic film. I mean, obviously the film is one of the most famous films ever made, probably. It was certainly one of the most famous horror films ever made. A masterpiece of Hitchcock's handling of suspense and horror and terror, indeed. Is a genuinely scary film at times, I think. And very starkly filmed in black and white as well. So whilst it is violent and gory, there's a bit of a distance between the audience and that violence. Hitchcock deliberately chose to make it in black and white rather than make it in colour. Colour was readily available, and loads of colour films were made in 1960. Clearly, he chose to stick with black and white for Psycho. The book is very similar to the film, so I have done a review of the book, which is on the channel if you haven't watched it already. So the book has essentially the same plot. What the book adds, if you've already seen the film, and you probably have, is you get much more of kind of Norman Bates's internal monologue in the book, which is fascinating. So it acts as a really good accompaniment to the film. I think a good companion piece. So definitely worth reading, even if you've already seen the film. Okay, next up from 1988, we have Die Hard, directed by John McTiernan. So McTiernan, I think, was a fantastic director of action cinema. Clearly, Die Hard is, an absolute classic of 80s action. He also directed The Hunt for Red October, which is good, and Predator, which is fantastic. McTiernan, I think in the early 2000s, ran into legal difficulties and ended up in prison for a while, and hasn't made any films since then, which is a great shame. So I do think he was a really fantastic director. Die Hard is based on a novel called Nothing Lasts Forever, from 1979 by an author called Roderick Thorpe, which again, like Psycho, the plot is very, very similar. And indeed, some of the set pieces that you'll remember from Die Hard, like the bit in the lift where he has to use the strap from the machine gun to kind of manoeuvre himself between floors. All that stuff like that is in the book. The one big difference is that in the book, the John McClane character is the father of the woman who works in the office building rather than the ex-husband. But yeah, still a very, very gripping book. The other thing that is very different about it is the tone. So it's much less humorous than the movie. And also it's quite bleak and angry. It's quite an angry book. Because the McClane character is older in the book, you get a lot of stuff that's kind of like a kind of clash of the generations, between him and these younger European terrorists who've taken over the building. So yeah, it's definitely got a very angry vibe to it. The other slightly amusing fact about it is that the book is actually the sequel to another book featuring the same character. That other book was also filmed, and in that film Frank Sinatra played the lead. So Sinatra was actually contractually they had to offer him the role of John McClane in Die Hard apparently, but fortunately he turned it down. I don't think it would have been quite the same film with Sinatra instead of Bruce Willis. Moving on then, another Hitchcock film, so Rear Window from 1954. One of my favourite Hitchcock films. In fact, probably my favourite Hitchcock film. I just think it's such a wonderfully put together piece of cinema, and it uses its constraints and that very small closed set really, really well. So based on a short story called It Had to Be Murder from 1942 by one of my favourite kind of noirish writers, Cornell Woolrich, who's a writer you just don't hear talked about nearly enough. An absolutely fantastic writer of crime fiction from the 40s in particular. Rear Window, the short story, so It Had to Be Murder, again is very similar plot-wise to the movie. The one big difference is that the Grace Kelly character doesn't exist, so is not in the book at all. There is, if I remember rightly, and it is a while since I read it, like another male character who's like a friend of the Jimmy Stewart character, who helps him out with stuff. But yeah, Grace Kelly is nowhere to be seen, so that romantic subplot doesn't exist in the book. Okay, next from 1982 and directed by Ted Kotcheff, we have First Blood, the first of the Rambo films. So a fantastic 80s action movie. I think really interesting in that it is quite different from a lot of the films that came after it, and certainly very different from the other Rambo films. In that it has, I think, more of a liberal tone to it, and the notion of this, this drifter character basically getting picked on because he's got long hair by the local sheriff, I think is really interestingly handled in the film, and as I say, a lot more liberal than the more conservative action movies that we tended to get in the 80s. So the book was published in 1972 and is written by Canadian author David Morrell. So again, the plot is very similar. It is again about John Rambo, this drifter travelling across the States, who ends up in the wrong town and gets on the wrong side of the wrong sheriff. What's different in the book is it feels much more even-handed in terms of the sheriff and the Rambo character get kind of almost equal billing, if you like, and you learn a lot more about the sheriff's past. And about his motivations and things like that, as well as John Rambo's, and it becomes this, this clash of their personalities, really, in a way that the movie didn't quite so much. So in the movie, it always felt to me more like the sheriff is just a representation of, established society, and John Rambo's rebelling against all of that. In the book, he's much more of a character in his own right. But yeah, a fantastic book, incredibly suspenseful. The build-up of suspense in that book is absolutely perfect. Morrell wrote a number of other books which are very good. One called Testament in particular is excellent, and also ended up then writing the novelizations of Rambo and Rambo 3. So he sold himself out a little bit, I guess, but I have read both of those, and they are both very enjoyable, and it's good to see, and probably quite rare to see, the author of a book that was turned into a movie continuing the book series by writing novelizations of the movies. Next up, and again from the 1980s, we have Angel Heart, directed by Alan Parker in 1987, and starring Robert De Niro in a slightly atypical role for him, but one he did a fantastic job of. So if you'll remember it, it's about a detective, Harry Angel, investigating a criminal who may or may not be the devil, and it's just a really rich and enjoyable film, based on a book called Falling Angel by an author called William Hjortsberg, and I may be pronouncing his name incorrectly. So the book came out in 1979 and is from what I remember of it, and again it's been a while since I read the book, is very similar in terms of the plot to the movie, and does, as the movie does, a great job of kind of blending together like supernatural horror type stuff and noirish hard-boiled fiction. So a very enjoyable read if you're a fan of that kind of book, which, you know, clearly I am. So finally then we have the OK film based on an OK book, and that is I Know What You Did Last Summer. So the movie came out in 1997 and was directed by Jim Gillespie. The book it was based on, of the same title, came out in 1973 and was written by Lois Duncan. So the book is a kind of YA thriller, which bears very little resemblance to the film at all. So the film, as you remember, is a slasher movie. Came in the kind of wave of slashers after Scream kind of reinvigorated the genre. I believe that the rights for I Know What You Did Last Summer have been kind of floating around Hollywood for ages, and various screenplays have been written based on it, and in the end they decided basically to take the title and make a movie of it. Yeah, as I say, the book, which is much more of a straightforward thriller with a heavy kind of look back to Vietnam, so coming out in 73, features a kind of psychopathic character who is stalking the heroine. But yeah, it's completely different. It is in no way a slasher, and it's set in a city rather than the kind of small town setting of the movie. So yeah, completely different, other than the title. But I guess it is such a good title that they were probably justified in stealing it for the film. Okay, time for a random book from the shelves. So today, in keeping with the theme of the video, I've got King's Ransom by Ed McBain for you, one of the 87th Precinct mysteries, my favourite book series of all time. So this is a fantastic detective novel about a kidnapping gone wrong and the kind of ransom demands and things like that. Very famously filmed by the Japanese director Akira Kurosawa as High and Low. I couldn't include it in the main part of the video because I haven't actually seen High and Low. It's one of those movies I need to see because I do really like Kurosawa, and clearly I love McBain, but yes, I haven't seen that one. But yeah, that's today's book for you anyway. So I hope you enjoyed that. Hopefully there was at least one book to film adaptation there that you didn't know about. But yeah, I hope you found it interesting. Do let me know your thoughts on the books and movies I talked about. And as always, I hope you're keeping safe and well. I hope you're really good stuff, and I'll speak to you again soon. Cheerio.